Welcome to Shedunnit. I'm Caroline Crampton. Like a lot of murder mystery fans, I consider myself a bit of an expert in the fictional art of murder. I've read enough whodunits now to think that I know how to use phrases like time of death and rigor mortis at least. But of course, the real science behind these stories is far more nuanced and complex than a crime writer can necessarily reflect. And that's why I'm delighted to welcome as my guest today a longtime friend of the show, Carla Valentine, who's going to give us a crash course in forensics as it relates to the work of Agatha Christie. A queen of crime, yes, but also someone with a surprisingly deep understanding of what happens to the body after death. Carla is a trained mortuary technician and the technical curator at Barts Pathology Museum in London. She's also the author of Murder Isn't Easy, The Forensics of Agatha Christie. When did you first get interested in forensic science?
I was a really strange child. I got interested in it very early on because I loved biology when I was about sort of 6 or 7. And then when I started to learn that you could actually use biology to solve crimes, as forensic science, I thought it was fantastic, and I just wanted to do that for the rest of my life. So I must have only been about eight or 9. And coincidentally, it was around the same time that I picked up an Agatha Christie book from the library.
Right, yes, because that was going to be my next question, is how did that connect to your childhood introduction to Agatha Christie?
So the first one that I picked up, the first Agatha Christie book that I picked up from the library was The Body in the Library. And I think in that particular story, there are so many different forensic clues and there's so much going on with the body itself and this way that they're trying to hide the time of death and hide the identities of different deceased. And that was really what made me think, this is biology as applied to crimes and puzzle solving. And for me, it's 8 years of age who'd been reading A-level biology textbooks. This was like a much more sort of illustrated and a much more rich way to learn all about forensic science.
Yeah, no, that is a perfect first Christie if that's your interest, because as you say, there's so much emphasis on, so much misdirection and so on involved in that. No, that's very fortunate.
Absolutely. It was that one and the Tuesday Night Club or the 13 Problems. It was those two. And it was just such a brilliant sort of introduction to Christie. And I remember reading the short stories and thinking, gosh, all of these could have made, the full length books. And she's, so it was just such a good way to be introduced to Christie. But definitely The Body in the Library was just perfect.
And so with that childhood interest and sort of nurtured by Agatha Christie novels, tell me a bit about what you then went on to do when you were studying and then when you sort of entered working life.
So I basically thought to myself, I want to do forensic science. I want to do pathology specifically because it is all to do with the body and death and disease. And I didn't actually know what that role was. I didn't know that it existed. I knew that there were doctors who were called pathologists, and I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to go through medical school. I didn't want to work on live patients, as sort of antisocial as that sounds. My interest was purely pathological. So I sort of had this kind of idea, I guess, when I was a child. And then one day I came across what the role actually was, which was an anatomical pathology technologist. Formerly known as a mortician, but sort of slightly more scientifically named now. And that was it. As soon as I realised that was the role that I was talking about in my own head, the Sam to the Quincy's out there as opposed to being Quincy, I just started to research that and look into the different ways that I could make that my life's work. And I was really lucky. I knew somebody who was an embalmer. Well, my friend's mum was an embalmer, as you do. And I worked with her for a short while, just as a volunteer, just to work out whether or not I was actually cut out for this job that I'd wanted all these years. And as I was doing that as a volunteer, I went into forensic science at university. And back then, there was only 3 different courses across the entire of the UK. I mean, now they're everywhere. But back then, there was Liverpool, there was Bradford, and there was Strathclyde, I think. And because I was from Liverpool, it just made sense to study it there. And then while I was studying, I turned up at the local mortuary, again, as you do. And I sort of said, hi, I'm interested in this as a career. I'm studying forensic science. I do all these different modules. Could I do some volunteer work with you? And they let me. So I was really, really fortunate as I was studying toxicology at uni and, all sorts of forensic topics, documentation and fingerprints and everything like that. I was also able to learn in the mortuary as well how it was actually applied to autopsies and solving crime. And then when a job came up, a full-time job as a trainee APT, it was great. I interviewed, and obviously I knew a lot about the job, having been doing it as a volunteer. So it was all I was really lucky, but I also worked for it at the same time.
And then you worked in that position for a number of years, and then you ended up now working as a curator. So tell us a bit about your curator job.
Well, the curator job is fantastic, really, because I've been able to take all of the information that I kind of sucked up and everything I learned as an APT for nearly 10 years. And that was, all applied to modern crime and, modern human remains. I'm the curator of a historical collection of body parts now. And because I've got an interest in Agatha Christie, because I'm interested in anything vintage and lots of medical history, it means I can apply my knowledge to that. So it's like I've got my feet in two different sort of worlds of pathology, the past and the present. And it's been really, really amazing to sidestep across. So I think 10 years in sort of modern autopsies, and then I did 10 years just this October, 10 years at Barts Pathology Museum. So I've been really, really lucky.
And the collection there, if I understand it rightly, is quite large. There's a lot of body parts that we're talking about.
It's a lot of body parts. It's the museum itself was built in 1879, but the earliest one that we've got is from 1750, and there's 5,000 of them, at least. And they span all sorts of different categories. You've got your cardiovascular, general pathology, locomotor, and we've got diseases like syphilis and tuberculosis, and then an awful lot of what was originally called medical legal specimens and what are now, called the forensic specimens, and they span sort of 150 years perhaps. And that's been really useful for obviously my love of Agatha Christie, but also for the book as well and all the research.
Yes, because you mentioned that word medico-legal there, and that was something that I learned from your book very interestingly, was this transition in the way we talk about this field, that in its infancy, it was very much connected to the legal process. Obviously it still is, but it's grown now into its own field of science. Give us a bit of an overview about how that happened.
Yeah, so originally it was even known as things like, medical jurisprudence, medico-legal, and but although the term forensic was used, as early as about 1900, I think, it took a while to get into the general vernacular. But obviously now, I think everybody knows what a forensic scientist does, don't they, really? And with things like CSI on TV, you can't really get away from it. And it's used even in the context of a sort of, close examination. So I have these Google alerts on my phone for forensics, and I always get these things like forensic analysis of match between West Ham and Liverpool, and I'm like, that's not what forensic means. But I think it's good in a way, because obviously then everybody's familiar with what it means, really, which is pertaining to the law.
Right. Yes, and I think people who read a lot of crime fiction, many of whom listen to this podcast, will be familiar with the sort of late Victorian idea of Sherlock Holmes crawling around with a magnifying glass, or someone like Dr. Thorndyke in the R. Austin Freeman stories, who's obsessed with dust and tiny bits of ash and that kind of thing. How does it get from that kind of early 1900s idea to the CSI, bag it and take it to the lab?
Well, I think really it sort of takes one great man who was, Sir Bernard Spilsbury, pretty much sort of unchallenged pathologist from 1910 to, the late 1940s when he died. And even though nowadays there's certainly a question asked about the fact that he was able to work so independently and be the last word on pretty much, any particularly famous crime at the time. And that a lot of that is questioned now. There's no denying that he really did change the face of pathology. And I think Lucy Worsley says that a forensic pathologist, is a Victorian invention, and she's sort of right in that sense, because, as you say, we do hear a lot of it in Arthur Conan Doyle. But Bernard Spilsbury in real life, he was like a literary character. He was like a character from a book, but in real life, very imposing and very stylish and very knowledgeable. And he did bring items such as the CSI examiner's kit, like a specific kit to examine a crime scene or a body, created by Bernard Spilsbury, because he was at crime scenes all the time, and he kept seeing gruesome things like police officers picking up chunks of flesh and wiping up blood, but with their hands and their own handkerchiefs, because they didn't have any equipment. So so I think with Bernard Spilsbury, we started to get a much more regimented and a profession, of forensic pathology.
And I always remember, I think my first encounter with him was when reading about the Crippen trial. And when they sort of had, is it right, they handed like a dish with a piece of the victim's stomach skin that supposedly had a identifying scar. They sort of like handed it round the courtroom. Yes. And I just felt like this is clearly a man who had a sense of drama.
Yes, because I think he was one of the first people in that job to invite the jury in to sort of take a look at what he was doing and explain to them. And, we still do that to this day. It was done in 1902 as well with fingerprints, the first ever time fingerprints were used in court, and the images were sort of blown up to large proportions so that the jury could see them. So it wasn't necessarily a new idea, but I think that he did it very successfully. And it certainly just made it so that there was more protocol. I mean, I say that there was also the time when he nearly drowned a female police officer in the bath trying to recreate the brides in the bath. So I think a lot of it was his own experimentation as well.
Yes, that is still a story that absolutely haunts me. Like when I did a whole episode about the brides in the bath a while ago, so if any listeners are interested, they should go and listen to that. But yeah, the idea that he scientific principle, try and reconstruct what happened, but if it works too well, you might accidentally nearly murder somebody.
She was lucky, wasn't she? I think she was revived after a while, but that was incredibly lucky given the success story of, George Smith's murders. So it's probably something he noted down. Don't try that one again.
Yes, absolutely. And another idea, I think I'm right in saying, from the very early 20th century that you write about a lot in the book is every contact leaves a trace. This principle that I think is still a foundational idea of forensics. Why is that so important?
Yes, they sort of called the fundamental tenet of forensic science that every contact leaves a trace, which was said by Edmond Locard, who was a French criminalist. So basically a French forensic scientist in about 1910. And that's really basically what forensic science is, isn't it really? Is that whenever you go into a crime scene or a room or anything for that matter, you're going to leave a smudge or a spray or a sprinkle of some part of you, whether it's saliva or a hair or some skin flakes. And that really is the forensic science's main principle, is that, and the more analytical we get with our equipment, the smaller those traces are that we can find now.
So connecting it back to Agatha Christie, she had this extraordinary literary career that spanned so many decades. How did she stay up to date with this kind of thing? Because as a fiction writer, you might say it's not really her area.
I think with Agatha Christie, she certainly was somebody who was a perfectionist, and she wanted her work to reflect reality a lot of the time. And she talks about it in later books a lot more through as you probably know, through the character Ariadne Oliver. She talks about people kind of pointing out when she gets things wrong. So I think as she progressed through her career, it probably became more and more important to her to make sure things were very realistic. And I think also she just enjoyed it too. The fact that they had formed the detection club and, she was involved in the detection club, and all of the members would talk about current crimes and talk about the different ways the crimes were researched and investigated. The fact that there were books like the Notable Trial series that, people like Agatha Christie read just for enjoyment anyway, and they would obviously give away a lot of the information that was heard in the courtroom. I think she just enjoyed learning about it as well. And she certainly did say that she read some of the journals, the sort of criminalistic science journals at the time too, as well as talking to people who were in the fields of law or medicine. So she must have enjoyed it, and she must have really liked giving her stories a realism and not having anyone question, oh, that inquest didn't sound very realistic, or and she knew she got it right. She was probably very satisfied.
Yes, I think, she was an enthusiast, like you or
yes.
I, which is quite comforting, I think, yeah. And you say in the book as well that you're always struck by her accuracy, that she didn't just blur the details or sort of fudge it to suit her plots, that she always made sure she got it right. Do you have a favourite example of that people might have come across?
I think one of my favourite things was actually when I sort of started to research the blood chapter, because I think, along with a lot of people in the world, I didn't think that Agatha Christie was a particularly bloody author. And I was pleasantly surprised, as somebody who's quite happy in a bloody environment, I was pleasantly surprised by the amount of blood in many of the stories and many of the books, but by the accuracy of some of her phrases. So, for example, she uses the term spatter when she says blood spatter, which is the correct scientific term, rather than splatter, which is sometimes erroneously used and can be a bit irritating. And she talks about, she doesn't mention luminol by name, but she talks about the development of this chemical which is able to show up old blood stains. So I think that was really brilliant for me, because I just thought, wow, she really has looked into this to get this terminology right. I mean, there's plenty of times when she plays fast and loose with the idea of time of death estimation and says, oh, it has to be between midday and 2. And there's no way that anybody can be that accurate. But she goes on to talk about that in other stories, or in prior stories. She already mentions that she knows that's the fact. She knows that a doctor can't be that specific. So we know that she's just using it for the sort of for the plot and for a bit of artistic license. So I think, I think definitely the blood was a really nice surprise, though.
And we'll hear more from Carla right after the break. This episode is sponsored by Girlfriend Collective. When you feel confident, you feel like you can do it all. And who says you can't? Whether you're running, biking, doing yoga, swimming, or sitting on your couch, Girlfriend Collective has clothes you feel your best in, no matter what you're doing. Girlfriend Collective produces sustainable, ethically made activewear for everyone. They use recycled materials to make their clothing, and their shipping is 100% recyclable as well. And on top of that, they have a garment take-back program called Re-Girlfriend. So once you're done with your pieces, you can send them back to be upcycled into new girlfriend gear and avoid creating waste. Everything Girlfriend Collective makes comes in functional fabrics, colours and styles for any activity. There's cute and comfortable bras, leggings, shorts, tanks, tees, swimsuits and more. And their sizing is inclusive, ranging from extra small to 6XL. They think about what you're going to do in this stuff, as well as what it looks like. For example, their best-selling leggings are both squat-proof and have pockets, so you can exercise in them confidently and have your stuff on hand. For listeners of the show, Girlfriend Collective is offering $25 off your purchase of $100 or more when you go to girlfriend.com/shedunnit. That's $25 off $100 or more when you go to girlfriend.com/shedunnit. girlfriend.com/shedunnit. This episode is also sponsored by Milk Bar. Are you ready to win the holidays this year? Take the traditional holiday gift up a notch or 10 with an epic Milk Bar treat. Milk Bar was founded by master baker Christina Tosi in 2008, and together with her team, she's been wowing the world with her unique spin on iconic flavours ever since. I was lucky enough to have a Milk Bar cake at a celebration on a pre-pandemic trip to New York, and let me tell you, it is still up there as one of the best I've ever eaten. That particular cake was their signature birthday cake, and it's one of their most popular treats for a reason. Once you've had this birthday cake, you're not going to want any other sort the next year. In addition to Milk Bar's usual bestsellers like the aforementioned birthday cake, the salty sweet compost cookie, and the Milk Bar pie, at the moment they have some mouth-watering seasonal treats on offer, including the peppermint bark cake truffles, and peppermint pretzel snaps. they would make the perfect gift for a friend or loved one that you're thinking about at this time of year. Every Milk Bar creation is thoughtfully and beautifully packaged, made fresh then flash frozen, and they offer fast, even overnight, nationwide delivery across the US. Right now, Milk Bar has a special limited time offer. Get $10 off any order of $50 or more when you go to milkbarstore.com/shedunnit. You'll get $10 off an order of $50 by going to milkbarstore.com/shedunnit. That's milkbarstore.com/shedunnit. This episode of Shedunnit is sponsored by Dear Homes, a mail-based Victorian mystery game. If you're looking for an original and mystery-themed festive gift that won't break the bank, this is ideal for you. Here's how it works. Every week, you or your chosen gift recipient will receive a real actual letter in the post that contains clues to help you solve a monthly mystery set in the Victorian period. At the end of the month, Sherlock Holmes himself will write to you and reveal his solution to the puzzle. So your challenge is to beat him to it. How you choose to investigate is entirely up to you. You can make it a group effort, perhaps involving friends and family in thrashing out the details of the case, or you can unravel the mystery all by yourself. You can also compete against other detectives all around the world, and if you send in your solution, you'll have a chance to be named Featured Detective and win a special prize. What could be more perfect for the Shedunnit listener in search of a whodunit-based distraction? To give this as a gift or to join for yourself, visit dearholmes.com, that's Holmes as in Sherlock Holmes, HOLMES, and enter promo code Shedunnit to get $5 off your first order. That's dearholmes.com and code Shedunnit for $5 off. I, like you, definitely think of Christie and lots of the other authors from that period as being quite lacking in gore, especially if you compare it to modern crime fiction, that they don't go into huge amounts of description of what the bodies look like and so on, and it all happens in this quite sanitized way later. But reading your book, and particularly the chapter on blood and how blood is used, I realised that it does play a large role, even if she's not talking about like welling pools of blood all the time.
Yeah, I mean, and some of the stories may mention just a simple rusty smear, particularly earlier on. But I think certainly as she progresses through the decade, she talks more openly about, blood flowing freely and dripping and spurting. And she talks about the difference between arteries and veins. She talks about ways to preserve blood. Also the autopsy, there's a lot more phrases about sort of gruesome, extra dead bodies, gory bodies, greenish tinge than I remembered from my first sort of reading of her entire catalogue when I was younger. So it was a real joy to go through it with my highlighters and be like, oh, I can highlight this as, a gruesome, gory body, and this says blood spatter, and it was great. It was much more than I expected.
For the forensic scientist coming on the scene or analysing the material afterwards, what is the significance of a blood spatter today that might not have perhaps struck Hercule Poirot, say?
Most interesting things about blood spatter, I think, from the later books and from on modern times is, of course, DNA, because, Agatha was writing only up until the 70s and DNA hadn't even, been discovered. It was sort of 86, I think, when it first came into the press. So, Poirot would never, I don't know if he could ever have imagined how useful, blood spatter would become, particularly because he wasn't really interested a lot of the time in physical evidence and, wanted to just think the case through. But I think sort of going back a little bit further, you can also see this idea that blood types, we forget that there was a time when blood types weren't even being identified and separated out, so that criminals could just say, well, I've got blood on me because I went to a butcher's, or, I did something with a steak. And there was no way to say whether or not that was true. And it's even in Mrs. McGinty's Dead, I think, which is quite a late book, that one of the people accused of murder tries to explain it away that way. And of course, then we were able to start separating, animal blood from human blood and then blood types. So Poirot was quite an interesting time for Poirot to be a detective, I think, with all of these different advances in blood.
Because he does, and of course, the portrayal of Poirot is not always entirely consistent across every story and novel that he appears in, but you quote quite a lot from The Mysterious Affair at Styles, where he does have almost quite a forensic approach to the crime scene, because he has his little bag and his little collecting envelopes and so on. And I think you mentioned in the book that that's quite shocking for the time that it was written.
Yeah, because with the crime scene examiners kits we sort of talked about, that they didn't come into creation in the real world until Bernard Spilsbury thought them up in sort of like the 1920s, and 1924, 1925. Whereas Agatha, as we know, she started to write The Mysterious Ferret Styles in 1916, came out in 21. And so she basically had the idea for a crime scene examiner's kit before one existed in real life. But I think with Poirot, it's really odd because, he doesn't really stay true to his opinions in The Mysterious Ferret Styles, and he chops and changes a lot. But I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that when Christie wrote that, she's very much leaning on the sort of Conan Doyle idea of Sherlock and Watson, isn't she really? Whereas I think he develops a little bit more as we go through the decades. But his relationship with forensic evidence really changes. Sometimes he's just in awe of it, and then other times he just shows it complete disdain. So it just depends on what book or what story.
One common element that you find in basically all crime fiction, I think it's basically impossible to think of a novel that doesn't do this, is fingerprints. And you have a whole section in the book where you explain the development of the science of fingerprinting and so on. But could you tell us maybe why are they so important? Like, what do they do that nothing else was able to do?
So fingerprints are they're probably like sort of one of our oldest sort of ways to identify human beings. And before they actually came into use on their own, they were used as part of a system created by Alphonse Bertillon, who was an early criminalist, who, again, Christie mentions several times in the Bertillon system. And what Bertillon did was he measured parts of the body, took a photograph of the front and the side of the face, and then took fingerprints. And after around 30 years of this entire convoluted system being used, it was realised that fingerprints were all you needed because of the fact that you're born with them. They don't change over your lifetime. Everybody's is completely unique. There's never been two people found with the same fingerprints. And so effectively, you've got a sort of 98.9% chance of being right at identifying a particular individual from their fingerprint. And that was a real game changer in sort of 1902, 1903, when crimes began to be solved using fingerprints.
Something that I learned from your fingerprints chapter that I did not know, which the slightly more squeamish listener might not enjoy quite so much, but is the process by which you get fingerprints from a dead body. Would you mind describing it for the listener? Because I think it's fascinating.
Absolutely, yes. So this is the I think they call it, in the long convoluted terms, the indirect cadaver hand skin method or skin glove method. And this was talked about as early as the 1930s in Argentina. And basically, when a person dies, their skin sloughs off. And if you're trying to identify a corpse who's become really sort of rotten and decomposed, and the skin has begun to slough off, you can actually just take the hand skin and put your hands in it like a glove, and then fingerprint the fingertip over your own. Obviously we would wear latex gloves when we do this, and I have done this actually, because the thing about fingerprints that is so important, people always say to me, well, surely we just use DNA now, but we don't, because fingerprints are an incredibly quick way to identify somebody and incredibly cheap. So we certainly don't just kind of do DNA tests left, right and centre. So in the mortuary, there was a lot of times when I would do this gloving method, and sometimes you just use maybe one finger or two fingers, and they're I think it's quite cute that they're called skin thimbles in some of the criminalistics journals. And another thing that we would do is odontology as well. We'd have an odontologist come and look at the teeth, because again, it's another really quick, really successful way to identify people, and also cheaply.
And that's another quite old method, isn't it? Because there are some crime stories from sort of 20s and 30s that mention that as well as a means of identification.
Yeah, definitely. I think even as far back as sort of the late 1800s, there was a murder of a Harvard professor, and I think the person had tried to get rid of the body by burning it, but they found a gold filling. So you can sort of take it back, as far as that. And I think it's interesting that in some stories, Agatha uses odontology not as a science, but as an observation, when Miss Marple in particular notices one of the victim's teeth and then listens to how those teeth are described by everybody else, and something just doesn't quite tally there. So at the sort of basic level, she's using odontology to say that's not the victim that we think it is.
So thinking about the way you examine a corpse after a murder and so on, obviously in the real world, an autopsy is a very regulated and practiced procedure. How does Christie incorporate that stage of the process in her fiction?
She does it with incredible accuracy, to be honest, for the time. I mean, nowadays, the likelihood of you having an autopsy is a lot higher than it was then, because we have a sort of very specific set of rules. I mean, certainly when I was working in the mortuary, if you didn't die of natural causes and your doctor hadn't seen you within 2 weeks of your death, then you would certainly have a coroner's autopsy. So that would mean that nobody would have a say in the matter. Now, in Agatha's time, it was a bit more relaxed than that, and doctors would say, this person, I've been treating them for gastric problems or for heart problems, I don't feel they need an autopsy. And that is definitely reflective of her time. It's also reflective of the fact that, as you know, a lot of people were poisoned to death, and people got away with it because we didn't autopsy regularly. And then you also see quite accurately a lot of exhumations in Agatha's works as well. So, Hercule Poirot will say something like, well, we all know that arsenic, poisoning resembles gastric problems, so we should have the corpse exhumed and, do an autopsy. So she was really quite accurate for the time as well. And it's the same about inquests, and the whole coronial procedure really reflected how it was at the time.
And you mentioned poisons there, which I think people do associate with Christie very strongly, that lots of her books use poisons. She herself had some background as a volunteer dispenser and so on. Is that same accuracy present in her use of poisons, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think if Agatha knew anything, she certainly knew poisons, didn't she? So she was quite comfortable using that as a mode of death. I know that she mentioned that she wasn't as comfortable using guns, for example, because, one can imagine she didn't run around shooting at things. But I think she got more and more comfortable using guns and other methods as she went through sort of the decades. But she was also inventive. I mean, there's a lot of sort of modes of death there that I had totally forgotten were in any of her books. So I think she wrote so much that she had to experiment, didn't she, really? She couldn't just sort of stick to one. She had to vary it a little bit, but she definitely knew what she was talking about with the poisons.
Do you have a favourite death that Agatha Christie brought about, shall we say?
Oh, let me think. I should have thought about that, shouldn't I, before we did the talk? Yes, I do. I do have a favourite death, but I think it's because it's one of my favourite stories as well, which is the death in Hercule Poirot's Christmas. So I know that we're coming up to Christmas anyway. I have to say I read this or listen to it on audiobook every single year because I just love the story. But I also love the fact that it's a kind of locked room mystery. So it's this question about how did the death occur. It's really quite gruesome, which I think is a wonderful contrast to the sort of festive cheer of the time of year. And also because there's a really interesting science in the story as to how the murder is made to look as if it was done later than it was, that I was absolutely floored by when I reread that book. I couldn't remember that being in it at all. So for me, I think that's probably my favourite murder.
It is a really good one. And I think that's the one, isn't it? The book is dedicated to her brother-in-law, and she kind of says, see, James, I can do blood and gore.
Yeah, it is absolutely brilliant, exactly. And what transpires is just so unexpected, I just love that contrast between this idea of the festive household, not that they were particularly happy in this story, and then this really gruesome death. So yes, one of my absolute favourites.
What's something that most lay people get wrong about forensics? Perhaps if they've watched a lot of CSI, they assume that it's possible to do X or Y, but actually that's not how it works at all.
I think a classic one is probably the speed at which results appear, because the CSI and things like that would have you imagine that you get your results really, really quickly. And unless it's some incredibly high profile murder case or something, it's just not the way it is in real life. And you tend to have to wait a week or two for things like toxicology results, serology results. But what I like is that it must have been the same in Christie's time, because Inspector Japp talks about this quite a bit, and he says, we won't get these results for a blooming while, and that sort of thing. I thought, oh, well, nothing's changed then.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because you definitely do get the impression from books and films that the detective just snaps his fingers and whatever information suddenly appears. But no, I'm sure there's a lot of form filling and waiting,
yes,
and
exactly.
the lab's backed up, and
a lot of couriers involved, a lot of red tape. And I think the other one as well, and you see this even in, Midsummer Murders, for example, is that the pathologist seems to know everything about every forensic science. So so they start talking about paint, and they're talking about mud, and this sand is from this beach, and it's like there's a lot to learn in pathology. So people tend to stay in their lanes. You don't get these kind of Gil Grissom from CSI or, Sherlockian encyclopedic knowledge of all trace evidence. Pathologists and, forensic anthropologists, they stay very much with the body and then leave the rest of it to the experts. So that's definitely something that on TV is a little bit skewed.
Yes, I think that's a really good point, and definitely one that I forget when I'm reading fiction. It always just seems so perfectly coincidental that this person happens to be a bone expert and they found some bones. But yeah, of course, not how it really happens. Okay, well, I think that's everything that I wanted to ask you. Thank you so much for being on Shedunnit, Carla. Thanks again to Carla for joining me for this conversation. Her book is called Murder Isn't Easy, The Forensics of Agatha Christie, and I highly recommend getting yourself a copy. I'll put a link to some ways to do that in the description of this episode. That's all for this episode of Shedunnit, and indeed from the podcast in 2021. I'll be back in January 2022 with new episodes. Thank you very much for listening this year, and for your support of me and the show. It really does mean a lot. This episode was hosted by me, Caroline Crampton. You can find out more about my guest, Carla Valentine, and all the books we mentioned in the description for this episode, or at shedunnitshow.com/murderisn'teasy. I publish transcripts of every episode, including this one. Find them all at shedunnitshow.com/transcripts. Shedunnit is edited by Ewan McAleese. Member support for the Shedunnit Book Club from Connor McLaughlin. The podcast's advertising partner is Multitude.